Hello, my name is Garchompro, and I've been Challenger since Set 2. In this video, I'll be covering the best comps for patch 13.24b, as well as how to play them. I'll be covering all of the S and A tier compositions, ordered roughly from strongest to weakest, although it's not an exact science. I'll be covering all of the S tier compositions, and all of the A tier compositions. As a note, Caitlyn Ezreal is just a variation of Ezreal and Caitlyn Flex, so I'll be talking about it in those sections. And Pentakill Mordekaiser is just Pentakill Karthus plus Viego with Mordekaiser 3, so I won't talk about it specifically, but it's also quite strong. I won't be talking about the B through F tier compositions today just due to time constraints, so if you want to check them out, make sure to click the link in my description that'll show this comp tier list, and if there's just a specific comp in this video that you want to see, all of them are timestamped in the description. This patch is quite flexible, so I'll be showing multiple variations for each of the compositions. As a general principle though, for a lot of these boards, you really just want to have 2 carries and a strong frontline, especially playing around the forecast. You can basically mix and match any forecast, so I'll show the most common ones and what I think are the best, but there's even things you can do outside of what I'll show you today. So starting off, we have Sentinel Ahri. Now this is probably the best composition in the game right now. It's just super consistent. Its level 8 board is pretty cheap and easy to hit, and can easily top 4, and then its level 9 board can win lobbies capping around Sona, so it's just a really powerful composition. The idea here is you're going to be wanting to run 6 Sentinel with Ahri, just giving as much frontline as possible for her. In terms of itemization, you're going to want to first prioritize your Ahri items. Her most important thing is going to be a mana item, so either blue buff or Shojin. Blue buff is definitely the better one, but Shojin is definitely an acceptable substitute. Gunblade is going to be her next best item here. Just being able to heal up your frontline and allow them to live as long as possible is going to be really huge with how tanky they are. You don't need Gunblade though for this comp to work, but it is very nice to have. In terms of damage items, her best one is going to be Nashor's Tooth, but in addition, Jewel Gauntlet, Giant Slayer, and Guardbreaker are great as well, and even Red buff can be solid on her. Generally speaking, looking at this comp here, I'd rather have Red buff on my Akali because she's going to spread it a bit better than Ahri, but if you're down bad for Ahri items, Red buff is definitely an acceptable one. In terms of frontline itemization, you're going to want to be itemizing your Blitzcrank. Spark is going to be his best item by far here because it's just going to enable your Ahri to do even more damage. You just want to make sure that you have your Spark directly in front of your Ahri. That way she's going to be guaranteed to hit the units that the Spark is. Of course, you don't want like Spark on like the opposite side of your Ahri like this because you won't be getting value that way. In terms of other items on your Blitzcrank, you're going to want to prioritize items that are going to have good synergy with Sentinel. So stuff like Stoneplate, Dragon's Claw, and Bramble Vest aren't going to be great because they're going to be giving a lot of armor and magic resistance, which you already get from the Sentinel. Dragon's Claw is okay because of the healing it provides, but it's still not amazing. I would much prefer items such as Crown Guard, Redemption, Warmogs, and Steadfast Heart for my frontline. In addition, Sunfire is another great item, but I would recommend putting it on either your Echo or your Mordekaiser, not your Blitzcrank, because you really want a 3-item Blitzcrank. Finally, to cap out, you're going to want to itemize your Sona. Shojin and Rageblade are her best items. You want to make sure you're going attack speed Sona. Your team is going to benefit a lot from attack speed Sona. Usually your whole team will be alive because everything's just super tanky, so they'll all get that attack speed buff, start hitting really fast, and be able to apply that bonus ult and hit damage from the Sona. Akali can take spare AD items. You usually don't itemize the Akali here, but she is something you can itemize if you want to. You can also throw spare AD items on your Qiyana as well. In terms of the board here, at level 8, you typically would just drop Qiyana for this board. You won't always have Sona at level 8, so you can just replace her with another Spellweaver. So a level 8 board could be something like this. You don't have to run Akali though on this composition, so you can easily just run a Seraphine instead of the Akali, and this would be your level 8 board. You just throw in an extra unit here, like Qiyana or Alawi are great options. I generally prefer Qiyana to Alawi on this board, but Alawi is definitely an option if you want a bit more frontline, although you're usually not lacking for frontline that much because you're running 6 Sentinel. In terms of headliners for this composition, I have Headliner, Sentinel, Blitzcrank shown. I think the comp does work out a bit nicer if you have Sentinel Headliner because you don't have to run a Cassante. But that being said, if you hit a Headliner Ahri, you're always going to take Headliner Ahri. So if you're sitting here with KDA, Headliner Ahri, you're of course going to need to throw back in Cassante. And then of course you won't have to run that KDA unit. So your level 8 board can look something like this. And then your level 9 board can simply just look something like this. You know, will just be your board if you're KDA Headliner. Spellweaver Headliner doesn't work out quite as nicely. Sitting here, you're of course going to have 6 Sentinel, 3 Spellweaver already, so you're going to throw in a KDA unit. That being said, at level 9, you can easily just go in with Seraphine, and you can go Sona like this, and this can be your level 9 board right here with 5 Spellweaver. It did get buffed, so it's definitely acceptable. I do think Spellweaver Headliner is the weakest one. I would prefer the KDA Headliner, but if you see a Spellweaver Ahri playing this composition, you're going to take it because it is a free Ahri too, and there's no reason to pass that up. On screen, there should also be the best augments that you can get for this composition shown. I do want to give a shout out to Cybernetic Bulk. I think Cybernetic Bulk is insanely good in this composition because all of your frontline units are going to have a ton of armor and magic resistance. So if you can just spread out your items a bit and give Cybernetic Bulk to all of your frontliners, they're going to be super strong, and a lot of times you can just win games off of that. I'm recording this bit after I recorded the rest of the video here. I know in this section I talked about running Akali in this comp, and if you have like an Akali 2 with 80 items, she can be fine. But I think in general, you're actually better off just running Seraphine instead of Akali. Even if it gives you 4 Spellweaver like this, I think she's better because she's going to heal up your frontline, and she's going to be a cheaper unit, and you're usually not going to have the items for Akali anyways, so it's really not worth thinking about. And then of course, if you're playing the Seraphine here, you can just opt to play 5 Spellweaver at level 9, just something like this. I would say Qiyana 2, though, is definitely stronger than the 5 Spellweaver, though. I think Qiyana caps this comp really strong. So yeah, if you hit like the Qiyana 2, though, I'd play that over 5 Spellweaver, but Seraphine allows you to just easily play this 5 Weaver at level 9 cheaply. Next, we have 6 true damage Akali plus Caitlyn. This board is very powerful, and this board here you can actually fit at level 8 if you have a true damage headliner. If you don't have a true damage headliner, I'll talk about what to do in a little bit. Of course, if you don't have a Qiyana, you can't play this exact board here. You can always just replace the Qiyana with Yasuo, though, to give you 6 true damage. I generally recommend against that because I think your board strength is going to be a bit weaker. If you don't have the Qiyana at level 8, I would recommend just dropping out of her and playing a better unit in her stead. So maybe something like an Alawi here to give you some extra frontline. You could also just play something like a Karthus, give Executioner for your Akali. You could just play like a second Thresh or something for extra frontline. You can also drop the Cannon in this position here, play like a better Guardian. You could even play like 4 Sentinel with like Blitzcrank plus Mordekaiser, and something like this would be acceptable at level 8. Of course, you can also drop this Thresh on this composition that I had anyways, for like, you know, Blitzcrank as well. In terms of your level 9 for this composition right here, you have a bunch of options. Again, Alawi is just a great +1. You could play a second Caitlyn, you could play a second Qiyana, a second Akali if you manage to hit it. You could even drop this Thresh and play 4 Sentinel. If you want to super cap out your board, I would recommend dropping out a Thresh and instead playing Yorick and then Poppy here. It's just going to give you a really strong frontline, so something like this will cap out really high for this board. In terms of itemization, you're going to want to prioritize Caitlyn and Akali items. Caitlyn's going to want to use generic AD items, stuff like Infinity Edge, Deathblade, Giant Slayer, Guardbreaker, all going to be great on her. Shojin's a great option on her as well. She uses it pretty well. Red Buff is another one that's amazing. Red Buff's both good on Akali and Caitlyn, but Red Buff's just, you know, an amazing item right now, so I really enjoy having that on my Caitlyn. Something like this is probably my favorite Caitlyn build. Infinity Edge, Giant Slayer, Red Buff, but honestly, her items don't matter too much. As long as you just have some decent stuff on her, it's going to be fine. Even stuff like Ronon's Hurricane is going to be great on her, and like Rageblade's okay. If you have Hand of Justice, it's fine on her, but I do prefer it on Akali. Last Whisper is another option. That being said, you don't necessarily need Last Whisper in this composition because you have, you know, true damage giving you true damage. Especially if you have true damage emblem, you don't need Last Whisper at all. I would generally prefer having Even Shroud though, as opposed to Last Whisper, but sometimes you just have to make do. With Akali itemization, you want to just do frontline AD itemization. So just generic AD items are fine, but I generally would prefer prioritizing them for Caitlyn. So stuff like Deathblade, Infinity Edge, Giant Slayer, Guardbreaker are all great. One other note about Akali's itemization is that she gets 36 mana refunded if she doesn't kill a unit with her ult, and she's 60 total mana. If she has 15 AP, that actually goes up to 40 mana refunded, making it 2 autos. And if she has 40 AP, that's going to make it go up to 50 mana refunded, being 1 auto. So if you can get 15 AP from something like a Hand of Justice, that's going to be nice. And if you can get 40 AP with something like Giant Slayer plus Blue Buff, or Giant Slayer plus Guardbreaker, or whatnot, that's also going to be really nice as well, although not necessary at all. She, of course, loves healing items, but she doesn't need healing items already because she has inbuilt 20% healing. But it's definitely acceptable to go like another healing item on your Akali. And Edge of Night is another great option on her as well, to help her sustain through. In terms of frontline itemization, you can do the Thresh like I had at the beginning. Another great one is you can do Blitzcrank. Again, I showed you the 4 Sentinel version with the Blitzcrank. In a version like this, you can put tank items on Poppy or Yorick. Also, tank items on Echo is completely acceptable as well on this board. I would just recommend putting your tank in front of the Akali. That way, if the enemy carries same side as your Akali, they're not going to target onto her super quickly. In terms of another variation of this board right here, we have this super fan version. This board is a bit weaker, it caps out a bit lower, but if you're lacking on items for your Caitlyn and or Akali, you kind of get +1 item here for them for free. In addition, this is like a bit of a cheaper frontline to hit, and a lot of times you might be running super fan in the early mid game, so it's easy just to transition into this board, go level 9. At level 8, if you don't have the Qiyana, I would just play the 5 turn damage board without the Qiyana, and then throw in the R8 level 9. If you do have the Qiyana at level, throw in the Qiyana at level 9 once you find it. And if you do have the Qiyana at level 8, I would recommend just dropping the Ahri and then throwing her back in level 9 for the KDA. If you have a true damage emblem, it basically will always be going on your Caitlyn here. She's going to use it super well. If you do that, you can drop the Cannon. Or of course, if you don't have the Qiyana yet, you just drop the Qiyana and play 6 true damage that way. In the case that you don't have a true damage headliner, of course, even with a true damage +1, you can fit the board that I've showed before. Now, if you don't have true damage emblem and you don't have true damage headliner, I highly recommend just playing 4 true damage. Playing Yasuo is going to make your board quality super, super low. So if you have Qiyana, just drop Kennen. And if you don't have Qiyana, keep the Kennen in on the board. In terms of other viable headliners for this, Executioner headliner is definitely going to be acceptable. It's not the greatest. I don't think Executioner is like super amazing, but it's a free Akali too, and you're always going to take free Akali too. So you're insta-clicking Executioner headliner. In terms of Caitlyn headliners, these are definitely acceptable as well. 8-bit's going to be the better one. If you have 8-bit headliner, you can drop the Garen for a better frontliner, something like a Blitzcrank here. That just makes the board fit a bit better. Rapid Fire headliner is a bit awkward because you basically always want to be playing Senna. That being said, if you do have Rapid Fire headliner, you do get the option of dropping Senna and replacing her with like Kennen and playing a board like so. Something like this is definitely acceptable if you have Rapid Fire headliner. That being said, a lot of times if you have Rapid Fire headliner, you end up just playing 3 out of 4 Rapid Fire because you just play the boards I've been showing. And there's really not much you can do because playing 4 Rapid Fire really just isn't worth it. But a lot of times you will just need to take Rapid Fire headliner for the free Caitlyn. But if you can avoid it, I would recommend it. A lot of times you'll also just hit like a Akali 2, Caitlyn 2 before you even hit one of their headliners. In that case, you could take like a True Damage Echo headliner is going to be acceptable to allow you to fit in that 6 True Damage. A Sentinel Blitzcrank headliner to give you 4 Sentinel for free is going to be good. Guardian Thresh is going to be nice because if you get to Yorick, you can fit in 4 Guardian. And then you can also just play a board with like Guardian Thresh, board something like this, and then just drop the Blitzcrank, and you can just play like +1 right here. And the board's going to fit pretty nicely. Like, so if you have like a Guardian Thresh, is definitely acceptable. And you can even play like 4 Guardian with the Yorick and the Kennen like before. Those are all definite viable options for your headliners. So next I'm going to be talking about Ezreal Flex. Now this comp has quite a few different variations, so I'm first going to talk about itemization, then I'm going to go through all the different variations of the comp. In terms of items for Ezreal, he's decently flexible. His favorite items for sure though are blue buff, Infinity Edge, and red buff. But he really enjoys Giant Slayer and Guardbreaker as well, and Rudon's Hurricane and Last Whisper are solid as well. Last Whisper is great on him, but I generally prefer to have Even Shroud. In terms of tank itemization, you just want to make sure you have Even Shroud +2 on your tank to enable him to do as much damage. Again, just make sure Ezreal is on the same side as the Even Shroud. With this board right here, if you have spare damage items, you can simply just throw them on the Jhin like so. This is going to be your capped out version of the comp if you have the 4 Big Shot, because you have that Big Shot headliner. That being said, if you have a Big Shot headliner, a board that's a bit more reasonable to play at level 8 would be something like this. You can, of course, drop this Cassante for a better Sentinel unit. You can even drop the Echo for Blitzcrank. But this board right here is going to be pretty nice at level 8 because it allows you to keep running that 3 Heartsteel. So you can get a bit more of those Heartsteel procs going into level 9 and cap out a lot higher with just a bunch more items. A lot of times with Ezreal, though, you actually want to be playing him with a secondary carry. So there's a bunch of different variations you can play. One that's great that I like to play is just duo carry my Ezreal with a Caitlyn. You could play something like a 4 Sentinel board at level 8 right here, or you can kind of just play whatever frontline. Ezreal doesn't really care that much about what frontline he has. He really just needs 2 Big Shot, and that's basically it. So, you could easily drop these 2 guys for just like some Guardian units, or you could even just drop it for like Poppy plus another Mosher, so maybe like Set. Something like this would also be completely acceptable as a board. Yeah, Ezreal really just only cares that much about having 2 Big Shot, and 4 Big Shot's going to be really nice. I wouldn't recommend solo carrying Ezreal unless you have 4 Big Shot, and in that case, once you get to super late game, you still do need to have items on your Jhin to be able to win out fights. If you're sitting here with 2 Big Shot because you don't have that Big Shot headliner, you're really going to want to have a secondary carry for your Ezreal, so Caitlyn here's a great one. You can cap out your like Caitlyn Ezreal board with something looking like this. Is going to be perfectly acceptable. It's fine to take another headliner whenever you're playing Ezreal. You could just take like a Caitlyn headliner, or even just a frontline headliner if you're sitting here with like Ezreal pair. Completely acceptable. Another variation I like, if you have a Crowd Diver headliner Zed, is to play a board like this. And then if you have Big Shot headliner as opposed to Crowd Diver headliner, you can drop the Yone for another Big Shot unit and play a board like this. So this is another variation with an Ezreal duo carry. You can also duo carry with Twisted Fate, which I'll talk about later. You can even duo carry with like Ahri, which I'll talk about later as well. Ezreal just has a bunch of different options. Really just try and get your Ezreal 3 items, a duo carry, and a frontliner. A lot of times you're trying to fit in that 3 Heartsteel during like stage 4 anyways. You can usually slot it in because you just throw in Set plus 1 other unit. Like in these Caitlyn variations right here, what you can do at level 8 is simply just, drop this here for a Aphelios, and then you're fitting in that 3 Heartsteel, and allows you to just cap out super high. That's part of what makes Ezreal so good, is it's so easy to fit in that 3 Heartsteel. So you want to be playing that 3 Heartsteel as long as you can. Even in a board like this, you can even like drop the Qiyana here because that slot doesn't matter that much, and instead just run a Kayn. So just have strong front line, strong back line, and try and hold on to 3 hearts still as long as possible with Ezreal, and you should be good to go. Another variation of Ezreal you can play is KDA Ezreal, where you're duo carrying Ezreal and Ahri. This is especially good if you're trying to play around Ezreal and then you just hit like a KDA headliner Ahri, or even you might hit an Ezreal headliner and you just want to play Ahri plus Ezreal duo carry because you have AP and AD items. So this is a nice cheap board you can play at level 8 here, playing around this 3 superfan, allowing you to get a free item for your Ezreal or your Ahri. Ahri superfan item is Deathcap, and Ezreal superfan item is Deathblade, so keep that in mind. There's a bunch of different variations of this board right here, though. You could even play like 7 KDA. You could drop this Lulu Echo for 2 more KDA units, play 7 KDA. That's definitely going to be an acceptable line. In addition, once you get to like level 9, you generally want to start dropping out of the superfan units. So you can drop like Lulu here for something better like the Sona. You can drop this Kennen and this Lilia here. You can drop then into like Akali and just start playing like better frontline, something like a Blitzcrank right here, and then maybe like a Thresh. So something like this is going to be an acceptable board. You can even drop down to like 3 KDA if you'd like to. Just drop out of this and play this board like so, with just even better frontline units right here. So something like Yorick plus Alawi is going to be a lot better. So you can even like cap around a board like this with just the 3 KDA, and that's going to be very powerful. Looking at the board we had previously, you might have a Spellweaver headliner for Ahri, but it should be pretty easy to just fit in 3 Spellweaver that way with like 5 KDA. And if you have a big shot headliner for this guy, you can actually just go back to the board that we were playing earlier. So I believe it was these guys right here. And you actually get the option here of just playing 4 big shot. So you can play something like this. And then again, you can drop this Echo for another KDA unit if you'd like to. Or you can just simply just stay in 3 KDA. So you may just even drop out of the superfan entirely at this point. Play something like this. And then just play like some strong frontline. So maybe like Thresh and Blitzcrank. This is a solid board as well if you end up hitting that big shot headliner. And you'll just have a really strong board this way, doing a bunch of damage with the Ezreal and the Ahri. So a bunch of different variations to the Ezreal Ahri. So yeah, this is another variation of the Ezreal / Ahri boards. Next we have Caitlyn Flex. Again, I'll first start off by talking about Caitlyn itemization. In terms of itemization for your Caitlyn here, she's relatively flexible. Infinity Edge, Giant Slayer, Deathblade, Red Buff are her best items in my opinion. I especially like Red Buff because she hits like 4 targets with her ult, she applies it really well, and she enjoys the immediate attack speed. That being said, you can also run Guard Breaker is another great option, Runeons is another great option. Rageblade is an okay option, I don't love it, but it's definitely an acceptable one. And then Shojin is another great item for your Caitlyn as well. In terms of playing around Caitlyn, she's really flexible because basically all she needs is 2 8-bit and 2 rapid fire. That's basically it. You can run whatever you want for your front lane and whatever you want for a secondary carry. She usually wants to have a secondary carry. There's like one variation where you run 6 Sentinel where she doesn't run a secondary carry. But her kind of main benefit is that she can kind of just slot in with any other carry. And pretty much any other forecast carry in the game, you can play Caitlyn with. So this is a nice default board if you want to play around Caitlyn Akali, and you're prioritizing the Caitlyn here, so you're playing like 4 Sentinel instead of like 4 true damage. You could of course play the true damage comp I talked about earlier though. And then if you want to cap around Caitlyn, you can play a board something like this. Here you can duo carry the Caitlyn and the Lucian, or you can also even carry the Ziggs here, or you can even carry the Yorick. So this is a very strong capped out version of a Caitlyn composition. This of course assumes you don't even have a headliner. If you have like, 8-bit headliner, you can even like drop the Garen right here. If you have rapid fire headliner, I probably wouldn't recommend playing for rapid fire. You could though, but it makes things a bit awkward. I would generally just recommend running like 3 rapid fire in this case. If you want to play more around Akali, you can play like 4 true damage, something more similar to the true damage variation I showed earlier. This is really good if you have this 8-bit chosen. If you get a Sentinel chosen, you can actually play a board like so with 6 Sentinel. This is going to be really strong. It's kind of a similar variation to the 6 Sentinel Ahri. I think it's a bit weaker than 6 Sentinel Ahri, but if you're sitting here with a Caitlyn 2 with Caitlyn items, you're not really going to complain about having 6 Sentinel. Just really strong frontline, works out really well with Caitlyn right here, is another option. Another option is to go Caitlyn plus Ezreal, like I talked about in the Ezreal comp. So I talked about that there. But something like this is going to be really strong as well. Another one is you can play Caitlyn plus Zed. A board like this is going to be really strong. Just this duo carry right here. As long as you have an Even Shroud in these compositions, these AD duo carries are going to do really well. Even Shroud is probably your best frontline item if you're playing Caitlyn. If you have Even Shroud, you're not going to want Last Whisper, so you're going to want to like replace it with something else. But yeah, this is a strong variation as well. You can even play something like Caitlyn plus Ahri if you have this rapid fire headliner. This 5 KDA Caitlyn Ahri, you're playing around Ahri, you just hit like a rapid fire headliner for Caitlyn. She gets this Shojin from Superfan, and a board like this is going to be acceptable as well. There's really just a lot of options. Just have a secondary carry for your Caitlyn, just have strong frontline. You can even take a frontline headliner. That being said, I usually would take either Caitlyn headliner or my secondary carry headliner. But there's variations where you go like Thresh headliner, Blitzcrank headliner, even like Poppy headliner is fine. Just make a strong front line, make a strong back line, and it's generally going to be pretty strong. There's a lot more variations than what I just showed, but I just showed some of my favorite ones that I think you'll be able to have success with. Next, we have EDM Jax reroll. Now, this composition is going to be really strong if you can get an EDM headliner for Jax. It's playable with Monster Jax headliner, but it's going to be considerably worse than if you have the EDM headliner. In terms of the idea here is at level 6, you're going to roll for your EDM Jax headliner, and you're generally just going to play Jax plus Lux at level 6, plus 4 Monster, plus whatever unit you have. So if you get like a Zac or a Zed, I would recommend putting that in for 4 EDM. Otherwise, you can fit in like a Bruiser here, is another acceptable option. Or you could even just play like a second 2-star unit, like a second 2-star Jax or something like that. It's going to be acceptable at level 6. Once you get that headliner for Jax, if you're sitting there and you have a ton of Jaxes, you have like 7, 8 Jaxes, I'd recommend just going for Jax 3 at level 6. Otherwise, I'd actually recommend going level 7 before you go for Jax 3, because at level 7, you're going to have much better odds of Zac and Zed, which are going to be your ins at level 7. And these guys are going to be buffing up the comp a lot because 5 EDM is going to be a huge power spike. So you want to get these as early as possible. Then you can hit Jax 3 at level 7. At that point, you can usually decide whether or not you're going for Lux 3. If you want to go for Lux 3, you can stay level 7 until you have Lux 3. Otherwise, you're going to want to go level 8. And your final board can look something like this. This is going to be a capped out version of this comp here. Tank items will typically just go on either Zac or Poppy. In terms of itemization, you're first going to prioritize your Jax items. Jax needs a healing item, so either Hand of Justice or Bloodthirster. Hand of Justice is a bit better, but Bloodthirster is good as well. And then in terms of his other items, his best ones are Jewel Gauntlet and Edge of Night, but Titans, Quicksilver are good as well. Deathcap is another solid option. And then you could even go like a second Hand of Justice as well. Giant Slayer is another option. And then Lux is going to take your spare AP items. Morello's great on her. Red buff is great on her to be able to apply the anti-heal to the whole board. Shiv is great. You can also just go Spark for your frontline though, but she's going to be your Shiv holder. And then Jewel Gauntlet's also great on her. You don't really want to be going flat AP with her because it doesn't scale off the EDM proc to my knowledge. So if you're going like Deathcap, you want to be putting that on your Jax as opposed to your Lux. One note about augments for this composition is that Combat Caster is great because it procs off of every EDM proc. And another augment that's fantastic is going to be Portable Forge, because if you can get Zhonya's Paradox, it's actually Jax's best item by far. If you look at his stats, he goes up like a full average placement if you have Zhonya's Paradox on him. It's just really powerful. It's by far his best item, so if you can manage to get it, something like this as his build is going to be the best. Make sure you save a bit of HP during the mid-game, because if you just like lose all your HP and hit Jax 3, you're rarely going to win out. You're typically going to lose to capped out like Ahri boards or whatnot. So make sure you're playing the game with a decent amount of HP, or else you'll just go 8th. And then, of course, whenever you're playing this composition, you're going to want to be giving the EDM to Jax. That way, all your other units, will apply the Jax ult, because the Jax ult is definitely the strongest of the EDM ults right now. And all your units will just do a ton of damage, especially if you have that Jax 3. You can play this comp with Monster Jax. If you have Monster Jax, I'll just drop this for like another Monster unit. So something like this. This is going to be a lot weaker, though, than the 5 EDM. Just keep that in mind. But, you'll probably end up taking Monster Jax just because it's +3 Jaxes if you're committed to this comp, but you're usually not happy about it. Next, we have Yone reroll. This comp is going to be really strong if you're sitting there with Yone items and you have a Crowd Diver headliner Yone. You can actually play this with the other 2 Yone headliners, but the best version is going to be Crowd Divers because it enables 6 Crowd Diver, which is going to be the strongest version of the comp. In terms of Yone items, you want to make sure that you have at least 1 healing item, so either Bloodthirster or Hand of Justice. And then you want to make sure you have at least 1 source of damage. Typically, this is either going to be Infinity Edge, Giant Slayer, or Titan's Resolve. And then you can kind of just throw whatever else makes sense on him. So either like a second healing item, second damage item. Edge of Night's another great one. Quicksilver's okay, but it's not amazing. So all those options are good for Yone there. So something like this, maybe, drop out of the Bloodthirster or the Hand of Justice for an Edge of Night is going to be one of his best builds. Unless you have something like Gargantuan Resolve where you can run like double Titan's Resolve plus Bloodthirster is another great build as well. And then you're going to be throwing your spare AD items on Zed and even more spare AD items on Viego Kiana. And then here you'll typically just be throwing tank items on Mordekaiser, but you really don't want that many tank items. So this is going to be like your capped out 6 Crowd Diver version. But at level 7, if you have this Crowd Diver headliner, you can play a board like this, and this is going to be great at level 7. If you don't have the Crowd Diver headliner, and instead you have the Edgelord headliner, you can play a board like this to cap out. As you notice here, we're playing around this Thresh Yorick because we have that extra Edgelord, so we don't need to play that Kayle. Or you could actually just play this board right here and just drop Evelynn for another Edgelord unit. So drop like Evelynn for Yorick. Sorry, not Yorick, Kayn, and you'd have 5 Edgelord. That's another option if you have that Edgelord headliner. I think like this version is a bit stronger, but of course, this requires you playing around like Thresh, Yorick, etc. So it's a bit cheaper just to be able to drop the Evelynn or the Qiyana. Of course, if you have Qiyana, you play Qiyana, but you don't always have Qiyana, so you drop Qiyana if you don't have her, and then just play 5 Edgelord like so. If you have Edgelord Headhunter here at level 7, you know, you would just play Evelynn over like the Kayle here. You lose out on the Pentakill, which does kind of suck. You can also drop the Echo as well, but I think I would generally rather have the Echo than the Kayle because Echo is just a better unit than Kayle. So you can just simply play the Evelynn. You basically always want to have 4 Crowd Diver in if possible because it's going to be buffing up the Yone and Zed a lot, and they're going to be your 2 primary carries. You'd pretty much always rather have Zed be your secondary carry than the Viego. You can actually play with Heartsteel Headliner as well. It's definitely worse than the other 2, but it's better than you'd expect because you end up just getting a lot of free resources from the Heartsteel. So you can play a board like this at level 7. This will be acceptable here, and you can kind of like stack up those Heartsteels. Again, it's not going to be super strong, so you want to make sure you're playing this with a decent amount of HP. But like sometimes you're committing to Yone reroll, and you just hit a Heartsteel Headliner, and it's like, well, you're probably taking it because it's 3 free Yones. It's pretty greedy not to. So you can play something like this at level 7 to get in that 3 Heartsteel. And then you can actually cap around board like this. Again, you're keeping in that 3 Heartsteel the whole game. This should look similar here, playing around the Yorick Thresh, and then this place playing Gnar, because you're playing Kayn for your Heartsteel. And so a board like this to cap out around is going to be generally how you cap around Heartsteel. And you can actually go first with Heartsteel Headliner Yone if you get enough resources. I actually think the worst Yone to go first with is going to be the Edgelord one, just because the board's cap a bit lower. Whereas this actually has like higher cap potential if you can get a bunch of items, especially like maybe like a Radiant item for your Zed or Yone or something off of the Heartsteel. But then the Crowd Diver version is just, of course, the most consistent one. In terms of positioning, I recommend generally just putting Yone on one of the sides. You want Yone to be opposite side of the enemy carry. A lot of times I'll position like this if I'm scared of the enemy carry being like on the same side, so you can position like so. If you're not scared of the enemy carry being the same side, you can just position like this. Is completely fine. I do highly recommend whenever you play this composition to have an Even Shroud. I typically just put that on Viego, and if you're doing that, just throw the Viego in between the Zed and the Yone. That way you're guaranteeing you have the Even Shroud onto both of them. That way you're just maximizing their potential damage output. Next we have Annie reroll. Now this comp is going to be really strong if you have an early Annie Headliner, and you can roll down at 3-1 and hit an Annie 3 really quickly and start pushing levels. So if you have like 6 or 7 Annies after you get an Annie Headliner in stage 2, highly recommend playing this composition. First, I'll talk about itemization, then I'll talk about how to play the comp and its variations. One important thing to note is that Annie's best item build is actually not lining up with her Superfan item. Her Superfan item is Jewel Gauntlet, which is a good item on her, but her best item build is going to be Nashor's plus Double Shojin. If you can get Nashor's plus Double Shojin on your Annie, I recommend just dropping out of Superfan. So, you know, this is like a default level 9 board right here. If you have that, in this case, you could drop like Nico plus Kennen, and play other units instead, maybe like 4 Sentinel. You could even drop like Kennen plus Thresh, and then again, maybe play like 4 Sentinel, or Spellweaver, or just like, you know, Alawi plus Set, whatnot. If you can get this build, you won't need that 3 Superfan. That being said, if you don't have this exact build, it fits really nicely to have 3 Superfan in, so I would recommend just keeping that Superfan in for the Jewel Gauntlet on her. In terms of itemization, her most important item is actually Nashor's. There's like a common sentiment that her most important item is Shojin, but I think that's wrong. I think her most important item is Nashor's. So you really just want Nashor's plus 2. Ideally, attack speed items are best on her if it's not Shojin. So Shojin's great, but then Red Buff and Rage Blade are also great items on your Annie as well. One thing to note is that Blue Buff sucks on Annie because it puts her at, I believe, 32 mana if you have 2 Emo in, which is just not great. It would work if you have 4 Emo, but 4 Emo sucks and you're never playing it. So don't put Blue Buff on your Annie. Blue Buff is great if you're playing Annie, though, because it's Ahri's best item. And so then, of course, in terms of further itemization, you want to be putting your other items on Ahri. In these boards right here, I would generally recommend putting your tank items on Nico because she's going to benefit from the KDA. But you can also put tank items on a Mumu, that's acceptable. Or even something like Echo or Thresh is going to be completely fine. Whenever you're playing around that Spellweaver Headliner, this will typically be your level 5 board right here. Then at level 6, you just throw in a Mumu. And then at level 7, you can throw in another Guardian. Then, you know, once you get to level 8, you can replace the Seraphine with Ahri. Play a board like so. And then make your way to this board right here. So you want to be putting in like Echo. At level 8, this is a nice level 8 board, and then, you know, once you get to level 9, throw in that Sona, and you have this nice capped out version of the comp. Again, Rage Blades and Shojins can go on your Sona. If you're sitting here with the Emo Headliner, it's a little more awkward. It's still solid, though. You don't want to be putting in a Mumu basically ever if you have the Emo Headliner, because 4 Emo's bad, so you're never going to want to play around it. So previously, I had the board looking something like this. You probably just have to keep it looking similar-ish to this. You may, like, drop out of the Kennen here and play Echo at level 5, but then you're going to want to put this back in. This will be your nice level 6. So you do have a really clean level 6 if you have the Emo Headliner. And then you can cap out around a board like this. This is just playing around the 4 Guardian like I was earlier. So this is very similar to board. To a 4, you can, just cap out like level 9 with a Sona here and play 4 Spellweaver. There's a bunch of different options though. You could even take a page out of Ahri's book and play something like 6 Sentinel if you have the Emo Headliner. This board doesn't really make that much sense if you're Spellweaver Headliner because then you can't fit in KDA, but it actually makes sense at level 9 with the Emo Headliner. So this is definitely another option. You can even just drop out of, some of these units right here and play whatever you'd like to. So you could even do something like go into Seraphine plus Sona for the 5 Spellweaver, and then you can actually fit in 5 KDA at level 9 by just throwing in another KDA unit like so. So this is another option as well if you have that Emo Headliner. Next we have Senna reroll. This composition is going to be really strong if you get a Senna Headliner and have a bunch of Sennas, especially if you have True Damage Headliner. If you have Rapid Fire Headliner instead, just like drop the Caitlyn or whatever Rapid Fire unit I have on these boards, replace it with a True Damage unit, and the boards will still make perfect sense. But it is a lot stronger with the True Damage Headliner. One thing to note about this comp is Senna is like a super contested unit, especially in the mid game. So a lot of times it can be really hard to hit Senna 3. So what I do recommend is making sure to scout around and make sure there's not too many Sennas gone. Because even if you have like 6 Sennas, if half the lobby's playing Senna, you're probably not going to hit Senna 3. And so you should probably like hold out on rolling for Senna 3 until a bit later, or even just give up on it. In terms of itemization for Senna, her best item by far is going to be Shojin. It is her Superfan item, which is why I am showing Superfan in a lot of these variations. That being said, if you have a Shojin yourself, you can consider dropping out of the Superfan, perfectly acceptable. I also think she likes to have an attack speed item, so something like Nashor's or Red Buff is going to be really good. I really like those 2 items on her. And then I like to have like some sort of damage item on her, so either Death Cap, Archangels, Jewel Gauntlet, Giant Slayer, Guardbreaker are all great as well. And then in terms of other items, you're typically going to be putting your other items on Akali. She's going to take all your AD items. You can even throw spare AD items on Caitlyn if you'd like to, if you have like Caitlyn 2 and not Akali 2. Or you can even throw spare AP items on Ahri on this board right here. Although I do think she makes a bit less sense than the others. I'm showing Echo as the tank here because he makes the most sense as the tank right here. But there is another variation where you don't run Superfan. And in this variation right here, you could tank like the Blitzcrank or the Thresh. And of course, if you're itemizing the Caitlyn in this variation right here, you can just simply run Garen over the Blitzcrank to give 8-bit to your Caitlyn. At level 6, your composition is going to look something like this, playing around this Echo. I like to solo frontline a unit, especially early game when I'm playing around Senna. That way they all clump around it and she hits everything in the clump. One thing you'll notice is I actually have Senna in the middle. Senna middle typically works better than Senna corner. You generally want to have your carries on the corner, but because Senna hits everything in a clump, middle usually just more reliable. That way she kind of hits in between 2 units, as opposed to on the outside. Whenever you're playing this board here, at level 7, you're just going to throw in some KDA units. So I'm showing Ahri here, but can be whatever KDA you want. And then at level 8, you're going to want to be getting in that True Damage Akali. And then at this point right here, of course, you're generally going to be dropping Aphelios for Caitlyn. And this will a lot of times just look like your board right here. You could play Yasuo over the Ahri, but I think the 3 KDA and the Ahri is way better than playing Yasuo. And then at level 9, just get the Qiyana. If you do have the Qiyana, though, you can definitely just drop out of this Ahri and play this board right here. That being said, if you do have the Shojin naturally and you don't need to use Superfan in order to get it, you can easily drop out of these units right here and just kind of play whatever you want with your frontline. It'll look a lot more similar to like the standard Caitlyn Akali board that I talked about earlier. So again, you'll just throw in like a Sentinel unit, probably like a Guardian unit, and something like this at level 8 would be completely acceptable. And then at level 9, you can throw in stuff like a Lowy. You can even play around like Yorick plus Poppy, or even just like a random Poppy as frontline is always going to be fine. So if you want to cap out, you could play something like this, and this will be really strong as well. So next we have Disco Twisted Fate. This is just a strong composition that plays a lot of uncontested units. So if you're seeing that Twisted Fate line is uncontested in your lobby and you have the AP items for him, you can definitely play around him. It's especially good if you have the Disco Headliner Twisted Fate, as it'll just stabilize you really hard at level 8, and then you can start pushing to level 9. One thing with this comp is you do want to make it to level 9 to actually start capping this board. This level 8 board isn't super strong going into like late game. If you're stage 6 with this board, you're going to be losing every round. So you do want to go level 9, and that way you can start playing on the 5 costs and actually have the strong board that you can go first place with. In terms of itemization, of course, your most important unit is going to be the Twisted Fate. Shojin is his best item. In addition to that, Red Buff Morello are great on him. Archangels, Deathcap, Jewel Gauntlet are great. And then Guardbreaker and Giant Slayer are okay as well. Nashor's is another solid item, but only go Nashor's if you have a Shojin, in my opinion. Nashor's without Shojin on Twisted Fate is a little bit weird. And yeah, this is just going to be your standard level 8 board. If you have the Alawi, you want to play the Alawi over the Zac here. Or you can also just play like Set over Zac here as well. Tank items will always go on Blitzcrank in this composition. Blitzcrank's favorite item is definitely going to be Crown Guard because he actually does a decent amount of damage, scaling off of his AP. And then in addition to that, he's actually going to be shielding more, getting the AP from the Crown Guard. So he loves Crown Guard, but just any other tank items is going to be acceptable on him as well. And so this will be your standard level 8 board. And then when you go level 9, you typically will drop the Nami for Ziggs like so, and start playing around Sona. You would prefer to itemize Sona over Ziggs here. You want to go like Shojin Rageblade on Sona. Always go attack speed Sona. It'll buff up your whole team and you'll start doing a bunch of damage. Because being able to buff up your Sona actually buffs up your Ziggs because she buffs his attack speed. So Ziggs will do more damage anyways. But you can also throw spare AP items on your Ziggs. Thresh here can also be replaced with either Yorick or Kiana. Both of these are great substitutions. And yeah, this is just going to be your general capped out version at level 9. If you have the Dazzler Headliner Twisted Fate, you're generally just going to play the board shown like here at level 8. You'll have 3 out of 4 Dazzler, which is a little awkward, but is probably going to be worth it. Because playing 4 Dazzler without Ziggs is a little bit awkward. If you do happen to have the Ziggs, you can just play Dazzler like so. And you can play this, but I wouldn't really recommend playing like Bard or Lux on this board. I would probably just rather play the Lulu than play 4 Dazzler. But once you get to level 9, this is how you're going to cap around with 4 Dazzler. And this is a strong version of the comp too. I think Dazzler Twisted Fate has a weaker level 8, just due to the fact that, you know, 6 Disco is going to be a really consistent way to get to level 9. But the Dazzler Twisted Fate actually caps out a bit higher. If you look at the stats, for some reason, 5 Disco, 4 Dazzler Twisted Fate has better stats than 6 Disco, 2 Dazzler, even when you account for Ziggs. So this board actually does cap out a bit higher, although you do have a bit less potential to play Legendaries, so I still would prefer Disco Twisted Fate, but this is definitely a viable option if you have those Twisted Fate items. One other note with this composition too is that you can also take Disco Headliner for Blitzcrank. That's definitely an acceptable option, especially if you're sitting here with like 1 or 2 Twisted Fates already. You may just take the Disco Blitzcrank, that way you can get to like 6 Disco really easily. Probably hit the Twisted Fate anyways. Finally, another version of the Twisted Fate board you can play is one like so, where you're duo carrying the Twisted Fate and the Ahri. So if you happen to hit like an Ahri 2 and have spare AP items, feel free to play a board like this. Of course, you would just put in the Alawi at level 9. And if you hit the Alawi at level 8, just drop out of the Taric at level 8, play 5 Disco, and then you can throw him back in at level 9. At level 9, if you want to cap out, you can also go Ziggs over the Nami right here. One thing to note whenever you're playing a Twisted Fate board is that Spark is great until you have Ziggs. Ziggs applies magic resistance shred anyways. But Spark is a great item until you have the Ziggs. Same thing with Shiv. But once you get a Ziggs, it is kind of obsolete. But a lot of times you'll still just slam it in the early mid game anyways because it makes your board a lot stronger. The most recent patch made it so that way 5-cost Headliner odds at level 9 are only 2% now, making it pretty inconsistent to actively play for a 5-cost carry composition, because it's a lot harder to guarantee that you get a 2-star carry 5-cost. But if you do manage to hit these boards, they're still quite strong, so I'm going to go over a couple of the different 5-cost boards you can play around. I think Jhin is definitely the best one right now. With Jhin, you want to make sure you have either Blue Buff or Shojin. Blue Buff is better, but Shojin is acceptable. And then you just want to go +2. At least one of those needs to be like a damage item, something like Giant Slayer, Infinity Edge, Deathblade, Guardbreaker. And then this last one, I think Gunblade is a really good option, helps sustain your frontline because you kind of want to have longer fights with Jhin. Whenever you're playing Jhin carry, make sure you have a lot of frontline items, because if your frontline just melts, then Jhin isn't really going to do that much, and you're going to just like start taking 8-unit losses. So make sure you have a strong frontline with Jhin, or you can just go double damage on Jhin is definitely acceptable. The rest of this board here is pretty flexible. You just want to make sure that you have 2 Big Shot in. If you have Big Shot Headliner, you can just drop Misfortune for something like a Lucian, or you could even play like 4 Big Shot, dropping out of like the Kiana or the Ziggs. Sorry, not playing Lucian here, playing another Big Shot unit, so like Ezreal. Play a board something like this. Again, dropping either the Kiana or the Ziggs usually here. Items can really go on whatever frontliner. I have them on Thresh here, but if you have Alawi 2, that's going to be better. Yorick 2 will also tend to be better as well. You could also even run something like a Blitzcrank 2 with an Echo. The frontline's relatively flexible. Basically, just make sure you have strong frontline with 2 Big Shot in, and you're good to go. Next, we have Lucian. Lucian is definitely a good bit worse than Jhin, but is definitely a solid option if you manage to get a Lucian too. Lucian really enjoys just like AD items, stuff like Giant Slayer, Runon's Hurricane, Red Buff, Infinity Edge, Deathblade, Last Whisper, all that stuff. He, unlike Jhin, isn't quite as reliant on having a ton of frontline, because he'll actually like get kills earlier on into the fight. Having frontline with your Lucian, though, is still nice, so make sure you have frontline itemization. Same thing with Jhin, you can be pretty flexible with what you have on your frontline here. Here I'm just running Sona and Ziggs because they're great units, and Sona will be able to buff up the attack speed of your entire team, allowing your Lucian to cast a lot more, because Lucian's like 125 mana, if I remember correctly. So the attack speed will help him cast significantly more often. You could even like drop out of the Ziggs here, though, for like a Jhin, and play something like Jhin right here, and then you maybe even put in like Misfortune. You know, maybe even drop out of like this Kiana or the Sona. A board like this would definitely be solid as well. You could, you know, even drop out of the Bard if you're playing this Misfortune with the Jhin. There's a bunch of different options as to what you can do. And then finally we have Ziggs plus Sona. When you're playing Ziggs plus Sona, make sure you have items on Sona. Items on Sona is more important than items on Ziggs. Against Sona wants Rageblade and or Shojin. If I have to choose between putting like my mana item on Sona and Ziggs, I typically prefer to have it on Sona because she'll buff up Ziggs' attack speed, and he'll be able to just cast a lot more that way. So it's basically like having a mana item on Sona is basically like having a mana item on Ziggs, because of course you always want to be doing attack speed Sona. So if she casts more, then your Ziggs is casting more anyways. Again, this board is somewhat flexible here. This is just a version I'm showing. You could always just drop the Lulu though for Gragas, and get rid of this Zac here. And then now you just have like an extra slot on your board to play kind of whatever you'd like to. You can mix and match. You could play like, you know, you could find a way to play like Jhin carry with this. You could drop like Lucian, go something like Misfortune, go like Jhin. You know, you could play a board like this. You could even just try and get more frontline out of this, put in stuff like Yorick, and start just like messing around with this. You know, drop like Blitzcrank, go for Thresh. You know, board like this would be completely acceptable as well. You could drop out of the 3 Spellweaver and play something like Set, but I generally wouldn't recommend that because I think having the 3 Spellweaver is quite nice for your Ziggs, buffing up his damage quite a bit. And another thing I forgot to mention is on this Lucian board, of course, I had Rapid Fire Headliner here, but if you don't have the Rapid Fire Headliner and you're trying to carry the Lucian, just like throw a Caitlyn on your board. It should be fine. Again, there's like the board's pretty flexible, so you can just drop a unit for the Caitlyn to get that Rapid Fire, because especially if you're like Jazz Headliner, 4 Jazz is really good. 3 Jazz is kind of whatever, but if you can get 4 Jazz, it's actually quite good. So you might just play something like this. Completely acceptable. Or you could even just play 2 Jazz if you're Jazz Headliner and just free up a couple extra slots. Again, these boards are really quite flexible. You really just want to play around whatever high-cost units you hit. Pretty much all of these 5-cost units are playable on these boards, so if you just 2-star one of them, just find a way to throw it in, and you should be good to go. Just make sure they have whatever synergies they need. Like, if you're playing Alawi, you probably want Bruiser. If you're playing York, you probably want Guardian, etc. Next, we have Crowd Diver Zed Carry. In terms of Zed itemization, you want to make sure that you have 1 healing item on him. Bloodthirster is going to be his best healing item, but you can probably get away with Hand of Justice as well, especially if you have some sort of healing augment like Harm Assist. Like, Hand of Justice plus Harm Assist should be enough healing. He really likes Edge of Night as well. And then you want to make sure that you have 1 damage item on him. Deathblade is his best, but I didn't show Deathblade here because then you'd need 4 swords for the build. So I put Runons because that's another solid one. Giant Slayer's also quite good on him. Infinity Edge is okay. Titans isn't great, but you can run it. Quicksilver is another good item, but I wouldn't recommend running like Edge of Night, Quicksilver, BT, because you're really just not going to have enough damage that way. So Quicksilver would probably go over the Edge of Night on that build. With this composition right here, you'd ideally have your supplemental items on the Kiana, but you obviously won't always hit her. So you can run Viego as a secondary carry. This composition here is pretty strong if you can get to the 6 Crowd Diver, but it's pretty reliant on hitting the Kiana, which is why I prefer some of the later Zed variations. Here's another variation of Zed. This one you're running the Superfan. With Zed Superfan item is Bloodthirster, so if you really need a healing item and you don't have one, you can consider running the Superfan, but I do think this composition is going to cap a lot lower, so try and transition out of this back into a board like so. And of course, these boards are only playable if you hit the Crowd Diver Headliner. If you don't hit the Crowd Diver Headliner, you're going to want to duo carry your Zed with something else. Here's another variation if you have a True Damage emblem. You can play something like this with the 6 Crowd Diver for True Damage. I really like this version here because you have the Akali as a secondary carry along with your Zed. Again, just throwing whatever spare items on your Akali. If you don't hit the Crowd Diver Headliner and you instead hit a True Damage Headliner, it's really easy. You can just drop this Evelyn for a True Damage unit. So something like so, and play 6 True Damage for Crowd Diver. Also a really strong variation. You can even theoretically drop down to like 2 Crowd Diver and play something that's a more along the lines of like a standard True Damage board, right? With just like strong frontline, whatever you want to throw in like this. You can end up playing something like this as well, which is 6 True Damage to Crowd Diver is another acceptable variation. And then of course there is the ones I talked about earlier with like playing the Ezreal Zed duo carry. I really like this because you're not reliant on hitting Kiana here, because if you just drop Qiyana for another Crowd Diver, this board still makes perfect sense. And even if you don't hit Crowd Diver Headliner, this board still makes perfect sense. You can just drop this, and you have this dual carry. Because the thing is, Zed really can't solo carry unless he's 6 Crowd Diver. But with 2 or 4 Crowd Diver, you actually have room to fit in a secondary carry. So something like this is a lot more consistent, in my opinion, and I much prefer playing around. And then again, also like the Caitlyn Zed board that I talked about earlier. Same concept here is another option if you want to duo carry Zed with a backline carry. Next, we have Country Samira reroll. In this composition, you're going to go level 7 and reroll for your 3 stars at level 7. This comp is quite good if you have a Country Headliner Samira. It can be pretty consistent if you have the right spot for it. That being said, if you don't have Country Headliner Samira, I do recommend against it. You can technically play this comp if you have like a Country Headliner Urgot, because the board would fit the exact same, but having 3 less Samiras kind of sucks. And then you can also technically play this if you have like an Executioner Headliner Samira, but the board works out like way worse. Like instead of playing Set at level 7, you have to play like Katarina. Board is just a lot weaker for it, because you really do want to play Vex in this comp because she makes it a lot better. And so yeah, you typically will stay level 7, roll for your 3 stars, and then if you hit all your 3 stars, you can start pushing to like level 8, level 9. In terms of itemization, you first want to prioritize your Samira items. She basically needs Infinity Edge to be a unit. You can run Samira without Infinity Edge, but it makes her significantly better. The thing with Samira is having more crit chance is just going to buff up her attack speed and make her do a lot more damage, so Infinity Edge giving a ton of crit chance is going to be super impactful. In addition to Infinity Edge, Last Whisper, Guardbreaker are great, Giant Slayer, Deathblade, Rune on Hurricane are also great items. I would basically only run some combination of those 6 items though. Pretty much everything else on her is worthless, so she's kind of picky in terms of her itemization. You can even go like double Infinity Edge is definitely an acceptable option. If you don't get Last Whisper on your Samira, make sure you get an Even Shroud on your Amumu. If you don't have either Last Whisper or Even Shroud, you're going to really struggle to kill things. Obviously, don't build both. Just one of them is enough. And then in terms of itemization, you're going to want to itemize probably Amumu next. Amumu wants to just take whatever tank items you have. So just whatever you hit tank item-wise, just throw on him. He uses them all really well. And then you typically want to be itemizing your Vex. She's going to use your mana items, your AP items. Vex itemization isn't like super important as to exactly what you're getting here, because she's kind of the 3rd unit you're itemizing here. So just throw whatever you have on her. Stuff like Deathcap, Jewel Gauntlet, Shojin, Blue Buff, Giant Slayer, Morello, all that stuff is going to be good. Archangels as well. Urgot is typically the 4th unit you itemize. That being said, sometimes you do itemize the Urgot before the Vex because you have Urgot items and not Vex items. Urgot's a great Thief's Gloves holder in this comp, so if I have a Thief's Gloves, I'll basically always throw it on the Urgot. In addition, he likes healing items like Bloodthirster and Hand of Justice. He likes AD items, stuff like Deathblade, Giant Slayer is actually quite good on Urgot, but you generally want to be prioritizing that for your Samira, so the likelihood that you build those on him is pretty low. Titans is another solid option, makes him a good bit tankier. He's the best red buff holder in this comp too, so if you get a red buff, it'll typically be going on your Urgot. And yeah, this is just your board right here. At level 8, there's not a real consistent in that you can put. Your best in at level 8 is just going to be a Lowy, but you can't always hit that. So you can always just run like some random 2-star frontliner, like a random Poppy 2 is going to be acceptable, or even just like a random 5 cost, like a random Qiyana 1 is probably going to be good as well. And then at level 9, if you manage to make it to it, which is pretty rare because you're usually staying on level 7 to hit these 3 stars a long time, play like 4 Bruiser is an option, so just throw in like Zac. And a board like this would be strong at level 9. Next we have KDA Ahri plus Akali. Now the one thing I will say is if you're trying to play around Ahri, I generally think playing Sentinel Ahri is a lot better. And if you're trying to play around Akali, I think just true damage Akali is a lot better. But sometimes you're sitting here with a KDA headliner, and you want to play around both Ahri and Akali, so you end up playing a board like so. Of course, if you don't have the KDA headliner, you can opt to play like a true damage board like I showed earlier, where you had true damage Akali with Ahri on the same board. I think that one's actually stronger if you don't have a KDA headliner. But with that KDA headliner, that board's pretty hard to fit because you'll basically always accidentally transform your Akali into a KDA one. And so you end up playing something like so. In terms of itemization here, Ahri really wants a mana item. Blue buff is going to be her best, but Shojin's okay as well. Her next best item is going to be Nashers. You don't need Nashers, but it's definitely strong. Deathcap is not one of her best items, but it is her superfan item, which is why I have it shown right here. If she's not your superfan though, something like Giant Slayer, Guardbreaker, Jewel Gauntlet, Gunblade are going to be great options on her. Akali wants to have at least one healing item, so either Bloodthirster or Hand of Justice. Hand of Justice is her superfan item, so keep that in mind. You could also go like 2 Hand of Justices on your Akali's fine. Infinity Edge is a great damage item for her. Deathblade's another great one. Edge of Night's quite good on her too, but make sure you have like some form of damage. She's your best red buff holder in this comp too. So if you have a red buff, you want to be throwing it on Akali because she spreads it super well. Titans is also acceptable on her, but I think is a bit worse than some of the other options. And you can also go Guardbreaker or Sterex on her. In this board, Nico will basically always be your tank. Reasoning for that is she's just going to get, better KDA buff. So you pretty much, if you're playing 7 KDA, you want your KDA frontliner to be the one holding the items, because KDA units get double the buff, so you wouldn't want your items on like Echo instead. So you pretty much will always be running Nico as your tank. And then at level 9, you'll typically just throw something like a Alawi in, and your board can look like so. If you want to really cap out at level 9, you could drop out of like Seraphine Kaisa here and put in something like Sona and start itemizing your Sona, and then just throw like a better unit in the slot. So maybe something like a Kiana here, because she's really good, or even just like, a Yorick to help slot in this board, or even another Bruiser. And something like this will probably cap out a bit harder than the 7 KDA board, but the 7 KDA board should be able to get you a nice top 4 if you hit it quick enough. Next we have Akali Karthus. Now this composition is pretty weak into melee carries, so if there's a lot of like Jaxes or Yones in your lobby, don't play this, but it's really good into backline carries such as Caitlyn, so keep that in mind. Akali and Karthus have really good synergy, because Akali will jump into the backline and get units low, and then Karthus will finish them off with his ult, so it just has really good synergy to be able to burst down an enemy carry at the beginning of the fight. A lot of times you'll just jump immediately onto their carry and kill it. In terms of itemization here, you want to make sure that you have Shojin on Karthus so he actually casts enough, and then you want to have AP items on him, so stuff like Jewel Gauntlet, Death Cap, Archangels, Guardbreaker, Gunblade are going to be great. As a note, his superfan item is Archangel, so keep that in mind. Akali itemization, you want to have healing, so stuff like Hand of Justice, Bloodthirster is great, and then in terms of damage, Infinity Edge is great, Deathblade is great, Sterax is great. She can also use Titans and Edge of Night as well, and she's also the best red buff holder in this composition. Again, you want to have tank items on your Nico if you're playing this 5 KDA version. That way you're getting the best usage of the KDA bonus, because Nico will use, the KDA effect better than other frontline units, because the KDA effect is doubled for KDA units. If you don't have KDA Headliner, I'll talk about that in a second. And then once you have these units itemized, you can even like start itemizing this Ahri here on this board. Go stuff just like, blue buff, Jewel Gauntlet, etc. on her is going to be good. And then if you want to cap out your board at level 9, you can just throw in like a strong unit, like just a random Alawi or a random Kiana is great. Another option that you have is you can actually drop this Gnar and go Yorick Thresh. And this is also a very strong level 9 board right here. If you have Executioner Headliner instead, your board will look something like this at level 8. Putting in that 4 Executioner with the Vex, and then you can cap out your board with something like this, dropping out of the 3 Superfan. So this will be a stronger variation if you can get those 3 items on your Akali and your 3 items on your Karthus with Executioner Headliner. And then if you have Pentakill Headliner, just look at the next section as I'll be talking about Pentakill boards. Next we have 7 Pentakill. Again, in terms of itemization, this is going to be very similar to Karthus Akali, so check that section for those two's itemization. And then Viego is generally going to want healing +2. Bloodthirster is going to be his best healing, but you can maybe get away with Hand of Justice as well. In terms of his +2, Sterix and Edge of Night are great. Titans is an acceptable option. You can also just go standard AD items like Giant Slayer, Deathblade, Infinity Edge. Titans are all solid on him. He's also a great red buff holder, because you generally want to be prioritizing carrying your Akali. So you'd rather put like carry items on Akali and then red buff on Viego, but you can also just put red buff on your Akali here is completely acceptable. And then in terms of tank items, you want to put them on Mordekaiser. That way he can utilize the damage resistance bonus from the Pentakill. And your board at level 9 will look something like this. At level 8, your board will typically just look like this. It's really hard to fit 7 Pentakill at level 8. And then if you don't have the Yorick at level 8, you can just replace him with Thresh, of course. Or you can actually even just play Kennen in that slot, because 4 Superfan's actually not bad, especially if you have the Akali as your headliner or the Viego as your headliner, because they'll really enjoy the HP and the bonus healing. Viego headliner will enjoy those a lot more than Karthus does, but it's still fine on Karthus. So something like this at level 8, and then at level 9, you of course can do the board that I just showed, like so. And then if you have Executioner Headliner as opposed to Pentakill Headliner, you can play a board like this. Will work out pretty well. One thing to note is that it's really hard to fit in Edgelord on Viego. You end up having to drop out of the like KDA Superfan stuff, which is actually just a lot better than Edgelord for this comp. So if you manage to make it to level 10, you can throw in like a Kayn for Edgelord, and this finishes out the comp quite nicely, but otherwise you can't really fit it in. If you get a Pentakill emblem, this composition gets a lot better. Pentakill will basically always go on your Akali here, and then you can actually just drop out of this Kayle here, and then at this board right here, again, you can throw back in a Kennen for that 4 Superfan, or you can just throw in like a generically good unit, something like an Alawi for extra frontline, something like a Kiana just because she's a really good unit. and play a board like so. Next, we have an interesting comp. This is actually Ezreal plus Twisted Fate duo carry. And so the idea behind this is a lot of times you're playing Heartsteel, and you end up trying to play around, like, let's say, Ezreal, and then you get your Heartsteel cash out, and it gives you a bunch of AP items. So you're sitting here with a surplus of items, but they're like AP items, so you don't really know how to use those on an Ezreal board, because normally you'd be playing around like big shots or whatever. So this is a great option here to duo carry the Ezreal plus the Twisted Fate, especially if you can get a Disco Headliner Twisted Fate. The synergies actually work out really nicely on this board. If you want to check out itemization for Ezreal and Twisted Fate, just go to those sections. So this would look like a nice capped out level 9 board. I mean, you could cap out even harder by doing Yorick over Thresh. And so this board right here is really strong. At level 8, you could simply just drop out of either the Thresh or the Alawi here. Also at level 8, you can play a board like this. A lot of times you want to keep the 3 Heartsteel in at level 8, so that way you can just keep getting some nice bonuses. So something like this at level 8 is quite good because it actually fits in the 3 Heartsteel. And then you can transition to like the board I just previously showed at level 9. And if you want to super cap out this composition at level 9, you actually probably want to play a board something like this, dropping out of the Twisted Fate entirely, and throwing those AP items on Ziggs instead, because this board is going to be even stronger than the ones I showed previously. If you have a big shot headliner for Ezreal, you're typically not going to care that much about the disco, so I would recommend just starting to drop out of some of these disco units. You can even just completely drop out of disco and instead play big shot. So something like this here, and then you generally want to have some frontline. So you could just play a board like this, and then again, to super cap this out, you would drop a Twisted Fate for Ziggs. And this would be the idea of the variation you're playing if you have a big shot headliner. In addition, you can actually play Twisted Fate plus Caitlyn duo carry. The setup for this is a little less common because you won't have as many items if you're not playing around the like Heartsteel that the Ezreal is. But the board actually does work pretty well if you happen to have the Lucian. So if you hit Lucian, Caitlyn on your roll down and you have AD plus AP items, you can definitely consider playing this board as well. If you made it to the end, I want to thank you so much for watching, and make sure to subscribe if you enjoyed my content, and I'll see you in the next video.